Welcome back to this second day of what I think everyone will agree has been a fantastic and insightful update. And it is wonderful to see so many people here at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. I think the calibre of our speakers might have something to do with that, so welcome. I'm Sharon Bessell from the ANU. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge their ongoing connection with and stewardship of this land. In this session, we have some good news to begin with. We actually have 10 minutes more than we thought, so we'll be going through until 10:30, and then we'll have morning tea break until 10 to 11. So we'll have each of our speakers and then questions at the end. We have three fabulous speakers to be considering, critiquing, analysing issues around security, human rights and civil liberties in Indonesia over recent years. Sidney Jones from the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, then Dominic Berger from the Australian National University, and Robin Bush from RTI International Jakarta. You have the bios in front of you, and I think most of you know each of our speakers, so I'm not going to waste time by going over the bios. Better to listen to our speakers. So please join with me in welcoming Sidney Jones to talk about counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency under President Yudhoyono. Thank you, Sidney.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to argue that, thank God, on the security issue, that SBY was narcissistic, aloof, and waffly, because things could have been a lot worse, particularly in the sense that we could have seen a convergence of the terrorism and separatism issues, as has happened in a number of other countries. And if he'd been a little bit more consistent on some of the security issues, we could have seen a greater role for the military. So this wasn't an issue, for the most part, during his first term, because the issues were so divergent. Most of the first term, he spent focused on Aceh. Papua was there. There were some developments, but it was largely an afterthought. And terrorism, up through those hotel bombings in 2009, was still seen very much as a crime committed against foreigners or against Christians in Indonesia. But what changed in 2009, as you see in the picture with SBY making that very emotional speech, is that for the first time there was a plot discovered to actually attack the president. So for the first time, really since 2002, terrorism began to be seen as a crime against the state or a threat against the state. And this is the point at which we could have seen a convergence of the crime of Makar rebellion and the crime of terrorism. And it never really happened, and I want to think, why not? Especially since under SBY, jihadis, violent jihadis, were never charged with Makar, even though they were very clearly and openly trying to establish an Islamic state and condemned the government as idolatrous. The only Islamists who were ever charged with rebellion under SBY were non-violent members of the NEE faction loyal to Pondaka Zaitun and Panji Gumilang, otherwise known as Abu Toto, partly because the government didn't have anything else to charge them with. And it's interesting that under SBY, rebellion was largely, not completely, but largely seen as a non-violent crime. Look at flag raisers in Papua. Also, there was the precedent under Megawati that SBY was obviously clearly privy to, where Abu Bakr Ba'ashir was charged with Makar after the Bali bombs because the anti-terrorism law was not in place. But the prosecutors couldn't make it stick. Why? Because they ruled that, the judges ruled that they couldn't get Bashir on anything to do with Bali. What they had was evidence that he was directly involved in the Christmas Eve bombings, and they said that bombing churches doesn't lead to the overthrow of a state, so therefore you can't have Makar. And presumably the same would be true for bombing hotels or other things. Only recently, in the last couple of weeks, has the issue of possibly charging jihadists with Makar, rebellion, arisen again because of the appeal over YouTube and videos of ISIS supporters in Indonesia, and the government got very exercised because for the first time, jihadists were appealing to possible supporters in Indonesia to drop their loyalty to the NKRI and join an Islamic State. Likewise, to its credit, the SBY government has never charged a single Papuan with terrorism, even when there's evidence that OPM fighters were responsible, for example, for violence against civilians, including the shootings along the Freeport Road, first in the period 2009-2010, and then again in 2013-2014. And you could arguably suggest that this was a deliberate campaign to create fear. But no one in Papua was charged with terrorism. This is particularly striking given several factors. First, both Detachment 88, the counterterrorism unit of the police, and BNPT, the National Anti-Terrorism Agency, which was created under SBY following those hotel bombings in 2009 and following his concern that terrorism was a threat against the state. Both of those agencies have in their mandate the definition of terrorism as including both radical Islam and ethno-nationalist separatism. So in theory, terrorism could have been used in Papua. Also, we had several instances under SBY where the anti-terrorism law was used against non-jihadi groups. First in Poso in 2006, when there were 14 Christians arrested and charged with terrorism after the execution of Fabianus Thibault and his friends, only because the government was concerned that it needed balance in Papua, in Poso, and that because so many Muslims had been arrested for terrorism in Poso, and because this was a tense conflict situation, they needed to be able to charge Christians with terrorism. So they charged these 14 Christians who killed 2 Muslim traders with terrorism. So if the government was concerned with balance, you would think Papua was the perfect place. Largely Christian, why didn't they use it there? Also, in 2012, we had 4 Acehnese accused of trying to kill Irwandi before the governor's election in 2012, also charged with terrorism. It's the only case under SBY as president where Acehnese were charged with terrorism. Also, we had the former head of Detachment 88 and the deputy director of BNPT become the Papua police chief in 2012. And you think, if there was any chance that there would be terrorism used, it would be when someone who was steeped in counterterrorism became the police chief. Also, the police really liked the anti-terrorism law more than the criminal code because it allows for longer pretrial detention, basically longer interrogation periods, and because there are far looser rules of evidence, and you can use electronic evidence under the anti-terrorism law, which you can't under the regular criminal code. This hasn't stopped Papuan police from tapping phones and getting evidence. It's just not used in court. Also, and this is particularly important, I think, during the second term of SBY, the crimes of terrorists and separatists converged because After 2010 and the breakup of the Aceh training camp, where we had about 9 groups converging in Aceh to train, to have basically a military training camp for terrorists, police broke it up. There were a number of people killed, over 100 arrested by police, and at that point, the targeting of terrorists from that point on became the police. So we have in Java primarily, but also in Poso and a couple of other places, Bima, we have jihadists taking pot shots at police. We have the only, with 2 exceptions, the only victims of terrorist attacks being the police. And in Papua, we have the OPM regularly attacking police and military posts, yet the jihadists get charged with terrorism, and if they're caught, which is rare, the Papuans get charged with makar. Also, we had a pressure group, and we know how sensitive SBY is to pressure. And we began to see, particularly with all of the killings by Detachment 88 of suspected terrorists, mostly beginning in 2012, that the campaign against this really took off. But we began to have a coalition of hardline groups, first calling for the dissolution of Detachment 88, but also pointing out the discrepancy between how the similar crimes were given different charges. And if you look, this is just one chart, but if you look at the number of people killed by the 2 groups over the period that SBY was in office, we had 34 police killed by suspected terrorists. We had 21 killed by suspected OPM. And if you look at the civilian figure, virtually all of those 76 people who became victims of terrorism died before 2010. So after 2010, as I said, the victims are overwhelmingly police. And finally, there was one precedent since Reformasi with individuals being charged with both terrorism and rebellion. And that was in 2003 when SBY was coordinating minister for security affairs, when the 5 Papuan negotiators who had been involved in negotiating the failed cessation of hostilities agreement were arrested and charged with both terrorism and makar. That's the only case, and there was a huge outcry, both domestically and internationally, at this misuse of the terrorism law. So we didn't have the convergence happen with Papua, and the interesting question is why. Now, as I said, there was an outcry when the Acehnese were charged. I'm not sure that explains it completely. For the SBY government, also, the crime of makar, the rebellion crime, was far more serious than the crime of terrorism because it involved disloyalty to the state. And that's why we continue to see makar being used as a charge against unarmed, nonviolent political activists in Papua. It brands them as disloyal, and it connects to the solidarity groups abroad. And there's no need to add to it by adding the terrorist charges. Also, it's interesting to remember that when amnesties were given to the Acehnese, the first group that was amnestied were the people charged with makar, because it was obviously a political crime. So if at some stage we have amnesties of political prisoners in Papua, the people likely to get out first are the people charged with makar and not people charged with other crimes. The one Acehnese who didn't get out was the 3 Acehnese who didn't get out were the 3 who were charged with the bombing of the Jakarta Stock Exchange in 2000. And they were actually not released until 2012. So if you're charged with terrorism, you're in bad shape on this. And I think the fact that we've now seen the ISIS supporters charged with, or there's a suggestion that ISIS supporters should be charged with rebellion, is an indication of how seriously the Indonesian government takes the threat, because for the first time, they're suggesting that jihadists are disloyal. Now, I want to argue that I think it was some of the flaws of SBY that we discussed yesterday that actually prevented this convergence of terrorism and separatism from taking place. First of all, his concern about image. That was pulling him on these issues in two very different directions, because he got praise from the international community for being tough on terrorists. He got a lot of criticism, including from Australia, about human rights abuses against Papuans. And we have a couple of cases where the police had actually sought a green light from Jakarta for going after the Papuans OPM fighters identified as the gunmen in those Freeport shootings. And Jakarta said no, because there was no way to do those raids without causing additional casualties, and they didn't want the criticism from the international community. Secondly, when Jackie Baker's paper that Dave summarized yesterday suggested that SBY allowed institutional autonomy to run free with the security forces, I think SBY's refusal to interfere in that autonomy actually allowed Detachment 88 to get on with its job without very much interference, and also allowed the Kapoldas, good or bad, in Papua, and the Pangdams, good or bad, in Papua, to basically have free reign without interference from Jakarta. So I think even if SBY's own instincts was to have more involvement of the military, particularly in counterterrorism, that kind of willingness to let the police and army do their own thing and stay aloof from the process, in this case, probably actually helped. His hubris in seeing himself as the great peacemaker, I think, also helped us on Papua, because with Aceh under his belt, he really wanted to be seen as the person who resolved conflict in Papua. And this led to a couple of initiatives which were well-intentioned, even though most of them operated on the mistaken assumption that if you gave more money to Papua for economic development, this would solve the problem. But I think that militated against a more hardline approach. SBY's failure ever to have a national security strategy, as Bob Lowry knows well, also, I think, helped allow for multiple approaches on Papua and on terrorism in a way where you could have mutually contradictory policies that, again, militated against more hardline approaches. And finally, I think that for all SBY's failures to initiate security sector reform or legal reform or do anything about military and police accountability, I think fundamentally the man actually does believe in Indonesia as a negara hukum, and this prevented more draconian measures. So I'll conclude by just saying, imagine what these two issues, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, would have been like if Prabowo had been elected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sidney. Powerful image to end on. I'm now very pleased to welcome Dominic Berger to the stand to talk about human rights under Yudhoyono. Thanks, Dominic.
Save it for after. So now everyone is awake from Sidney's presentation. I will talk about human rights. So I'll start out with a few remarks about how we might fairly judge Yudhoyono's performance in the field of human rights, and then I will map out some of the kinds of assessments that have been made of him. And then in the second half of my presentation, I will look at 4 critical case studies. I will look at justice for past human rights abuses, in particular the case of 1965. I will look at the legal proceedings in the murder of Munir. I will look at political prisoners in Papua and Maluku, and finally the freedom of expression on the internet. There are, of course, many other important human rights issues that I could look at, but I suggest that these are the four that are amongst those that are most strongly going to be associated with the Yudhoyono presidency. They also reveal, I argue, that at crucial moments, Yudhoyono consistently failed to exert his presidential mandate for the sake of deepening human rights. Indeed, it is a paradox that a president who so carefully cultivates his image as a modern statesman has shown such reluctance to invest political capital in the deepening of human rights standards. On the other hand, during a time when many other countries in the region, and indeed the world, suffered deterioration in human rights, Yudhoyono oversaw at most a stagnation of rights, and so I will conclude with a mixed report card. So a fair assessment of Yudhoyono's human rights records begins firstly with the consideration of the kind of human rights protections that were already in place when Yudhoyono became president in 2004, and secondly, what powers the president has at his disposal to influence the protection of human rights. Despite many shortcomings, when he became president in 2004, basic human rights standards were already part of Indonesia's legal and constitutional framework. So in many instances, the protection of Indonesia's human rights during the Yudhoyono years was merely a consequence of reforms achieved under his predecessors. Yudhoyono was expected instead not only to consolidate these achievements, but to deepen the protection of human rights. At the same time, many of the reforms that occurred during the Yudhoyono years were initiated and implemented not by the president, but by other institutions. For example, in 2005, the People's Representative Council, or the DPR, ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In 2006 and 2007, the Constitutional Court ruled as unconstitutional articles in the Criminal Code pertaining to insulting the president, as well as articles on hate sowing. None of these can be accredited to Yudhoyono himself. In fact, until ruled unconstitutional, Yudhoyono had used these articles against critics of his government. But if we deny Yudhoyono excessive credit, we should also avoid apportioning him excessive blame for every deterioration of human rights that occurred during his presidency. Many other institutions, including the two I just mentioned, have succumbed to illiberal and conservative interests and threatened human rights. So keeping these qualifications in mind, I argue that when it came to human rights, Yudhoyono was often the target of excessive praise from some quarters, as well as excessive blame from others. So excessive praise often came from those sources that most dominantly shaped international opinions, visiting leaders of Western democracies and mainstream media commentaries. Indeed, Yudhoyono actively cultivated Indonesia's image as a moderate and rights-respecting democracy, and he presented himself as a champion of human rights. Few other leaders in the region appeared as comfortable when speaking about human rights to an international audience. And few carried the clout, as Yudhoyono did, in his attempt to promote human rights within ASEAN and through the Bali Democracy Forum more widely. For Indonesia's apparent embrace of universal human rights, outside observers have often accredited Yudhoyono's personal leadership. Those who praise Yudhoyono as a progressive leader of human rights might refer to these increasingly positive assessment of Indonesia's human rights, in particular the civil and political rights that democracy indexes produce, such as Freedom House. Early in Yudhoyono's first term, Freedom House rated Indonesia as free for the first time, making Indonesia the only free country in Southeast Asia in terms of its civil and political rights. So it was during Yudhoyono's presidency that Indonesia cemented its international image as a rights-respecting democracy, and Yudhoyono perhaps reaped a disproportionate share of the credit for that. Meanwhile, those who set international human rights standards, namely the United Nations, have taken a more sober assessment of Yudhoyono. During his presidency, Indonesia twice submitted to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review in 2008 and 2012, and the most frequent human rights issues raised at this review were issues related to land disputes, followed by religious freedom, violence in Papua, and women's rights. Another recurring problem raised was the continued impunity of law enforcement agencies and security agencies. Also taking a harsher view of Yudhoyono's human rights record were local human rights activists and organizations. And it's really hard to overstate the deep sense of disappointment that had festered in the final years of Yudhoyono's presidency. In 2013, a survey of 200 human rights activists conducted by the Setara Institute reflected this mood. Over half felt that the protection of human rights had stagnated since 2004, while 36% even felt that it had regressed. Strikingly, the survey found that activists overwhelmingly blamed Yudhoyono himself for this regression. When asked to name the biggest challenge for the protection of human rights, over half named the commitment of the president as the most important factor, and only a few blamed the DPR, the legal framework, or an intolerant society. More than half of the respondents think that Yudhoyono holds a low commitment to human rights, while a further 38% think that he holds no commitment at all. In other words, Indonesian activists overwhelmingly expect the president to stand up for human rights, but they don't believe that he is willing to do so. But despite this sense of disappointment, even most of his critics wouldn't accuse Yudhoyono of actively working to undermine human rights. Rather, as I argue in the following case studies, it's been his consistent absence of leadership that has been most consequential. So prior to Yudhoyono's presidency, there were already several attempts to address the serious human rights abuses of the past, in particular those committed during the New Order. But neither domestic avenues to justice, such as ad hoc human rights courts or truth and reconciliation commissions, nor the ascension to international mechanisms via the ratification of the Rome Statute, succeeded in delivering meaningful justice. While many cases remain unaddressed, the killing of up to 1 million suspected members and sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965 and the decades-long stigmatization of the survivors and their family members remains Indonesia's most intractable historical injustice. The age of the victims and the perpetrators means that Yudhoyono's presidency was perhaps the last window of opportunity for justice. Towards the end of his presidency, some pressure mounted on the government to take substantive action for the sake of reconciliation, with one proposal being a presidential apology. In 2012, the National Human Rights Commission, Komnas HAM, published an in-depth report on the violence of 1965, which concluded that serious human rights violations had been perpetrated by the state. While the report was nearing completion in late 2011, 3 Komnas HAM commissioners met with Yudhoyono briefly to brief him on the imminent release of the report and to offer advice about how he might respond to it. Hoping to instill a sense of urgency into the situation, one commissioner recommended that Yudhoyono, with only 2 years left in office, if he failed to adequately respond to the report, it could be seen as a stain on his legacy. The commissioner told me that Yudhoyono reacted with visible indignation to this suggestion, asking, "Why should I be the one to do something? I'm not one of the perpetrators." Despite this apparent failure to grasp the symbolic and the symbolic responsibilities of the presidency, the commissioners convinced Yudhoyono to order a series of meetings between Komnas HAM, the Attorney General, and the coordinating Minister for Politics, Law and Security, Joko Suyanto. These took place, but as soon as Yudhoyono was out of the picture, both institutions became uncooperative. Clearly, Yudhoyono's role here was crucial. In 2012, the UN expressed concern over the inability of Komnas HAM to force the Attorney General to prosecute cases. But by mid-2012, Yudhoyono's most senior ministers openly rejected the core findings of the Komnas HAM report, suggesting, amongst other things, that the killings were justified. While Yudhoyono's Democrat Party nominated Sarwo Edi Wibowo, a key figure in the anti-communist killings, and Yudhoyono's father-in-law, to be named as a national hero. Hopes for a presidential apology quickly evaporated. Intimidation and violence towards human rights activists was not uncommon at the time, but the murder of Munir Said Talib in 2004 triggered unprecedented outrage and international attention. Within weeks, it was widely believed that the murder was planned at the highest echelons of the state intelligence agency. Munir's prominence in the human rights community and the brazen circumstances of his murder suggested that the security apparatus continued to enjoy a shocking degree of impunity. Within weeks, Yudhoyono issued a presidential decree that established an independent fact-finding team. Shortly after, Yudhoyono met Munir's wife, Suciwati, and other activists at the presidential palace, where the recently sworn-in president famously stated that bringing the perpetrators to justice would be the test of Indonesian history. While the murder took place shortly before his election, it became Yudhoyono's responsibility to prove that under his presidency, the assassination of human rights activists would not go unpunished. During the trial of Polikarpus, the off-duty Garuda Indonesia pilot and suspected BIN agent, who was convicted of Munir's murder in 2005, evidence had surfaced that indicated a much deeper role by BIN. In 2008, prosecutors charged BIN's deputy director and former Kopassus commander, Mukti, with Munir's murder. Never before had such a senior figure from either BIN or Kopassus been charged with such a serious crime. This raised the question over the appropriate degree of presidential intervention in the high-profile legal proceedings. On several occasions, Yudhoyono formally ordered BIN and other state agencies to cooperate with the investigation. Yet at the same time, he took care to appear not to intervene in the proceedings, at one point arguing, "I never intervened. I can't instruct judges or prosecutors or the police." When Mukti was acquitted and Yudhoyono was asked for comment, he complained, "My staff told me the journalists want a comment. I'm the president. It's not possible I comment on all things in this country. I make policies. I can quickly comment if it's a disaster or other emergency things." But firm presidential oversight of the legal proceedings was precisely what local activists and international observers demanded. For example, when during Mukti's trial, it was clear that judges, prosecutors, and witnesses were subject to enormous pressure and intimidation. In 2008, the European Union expressed concern over the judicial process, and in 2010, after Mukti's acquittal, Human Rights Watch urged Yudhoyono to reopen the inquiry into his murder, which has not happened. I recently asked Munir's wife, Suciwati, how she assesses Yudhoyono's performance in the case. She gives Yudhoyono 1 out of 10. The 1 is for setting up the independent fact-finding mission in 2004. After that, she said he did little else. While Yudhoyono proudly counts Aceh as one of his key accomplishments, ending political tension and human rights abuses in Papua has been more elusive. Large-scale violence has arguably been reduced since the height of New Order oppression, but the Yudhoyono years saw a rising trend towards criminalization of peaceful activism in Papua. Every year, dozens of non-violent pro-independence activists are charged with makar, or rebellion, for peacefully displaying or raising separatist flags. The website Papuans Behind Bars, for example, lists 48 Papuans currently in jail, many of whom suffer torture and ill treatment during their imprisonment. Over the last decade, local and international human rights organizations have increasingly drawn attention to the political prisoners, a term the government rejects. In 2011, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that the 15-year sentence given to Papuan leader Philip Khama in 2005 was arbitrary and in breach of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. While former President Abdurrahman Wahid granted the Morning Star flag de facto legal status, the Megawati government's return towards criminalization was firmly institutionalized during Yudhoyono's presidency, for example, with a regulation in 2006 banning separatist symbols. Yudhoyono's implicit sanctioning of the practice became clear in 2007, when on a visit to Ambon, a group of protesters unfurled the Benang Raja flag of the Republic of South Maluku in front of Yudhoyono. The group was arrested within seconds, severely beaten and tortured, and sentenced to between 7 and 20 years for rebellion. Yudhoyono was reportedly furious at this blatant security breach and saw it as a personal affront, which is likely to have paved the way for the prosecutors to issue large sentences. There is no evidence to suggest that Yudhoyono disapproves of long prison terms for non-violent expressions of separatism. Speaking to army graduates at a military school in 2012, Yudhoyono stated that the attempts of those who want to secede are best described not as freedom of speech, but as separatism. It must be stopped. Under Yudhoyono, the growth of the internet and the appearance of social media has given citizens much greater opportunities to express critical and controversial views, but also more opportunities for the government to restrict, monitor, and criminalize them. Reports by international and local human rights organizations have found that none of the government's attempts at filtering and monitoring were systematically aimed at content critical of the government or the state ideology. Instead, censorship is directed towards sites with controversial social or moral content, reflecting the Yudhoyono government's drift towards social conservative politics. For example, LGBT sites and content deemed blasphemous is often blocked. Another disturbing trend has been the increasingly arbitrary and widespread use of online criminal defamation laws. In 2008, the Parliament, with the agreement of Yudhoyono's Democrat Party, issued the Law on Information and Electronic Transaction, or the ITE law, which provides for a maximum jail sentence of 6 years for anyone who transmits electronic information deemed insulting or defamatory. The law's 6-year jail term puts those accused of online defamation at the mercy of the police, who have the power to detain suspects facing a sentence of 5 years or more. So merely being reported to the police for a harmless tweet, a Facebook status, an email, or even an SMS has landed many internet users, including bloggers, journalists, anti-corruption activists, and students, in jail. In recent weeks, it was even used to threaten those who insult cities, with this poor student from Jogja spending a couple of nights in jail in Jakarta for saying mean things about the good people of Jakarta. In 2009, the Constitutional Court upheld the law, but when in 2012, the Supreme Court overturned a defamation conviction of a woman who had criticized a hospital in a private email, lawmakers of Indonesia's Yudhoyono's Democratic Party promised a revision of the law, which has not occurred until today. Yudhoyono is well known for his sensitivity to criticism of himself and his family, and it appears he supports a harsh anti-defamation regime. At a media event in 2013, Yudhoyono stated that, "I realized that as a leader, I must get used to condemnation and praise. But one thing I have difficulty accepting is defamation. Don't turn this country into a sea of defamation," he said. "Make it a sea of truth." So in that spirit, my concluding remarks: Indonesia's basic protection of civil and political rights remains intact, not because of Yudhoyono, but rather in spite of him. Avoiding a major rollback of human rights protection is a testimony to Indonesia's engaged and resolute civil society, which in many instances would have welcomed a helping hand from the president. But all too often, he allowed anti-democratic forces to expand restrictions precisely on those rights that allow civil society the freedom to function effectively. In 2013, the law on societal organizations, for example, was widely criticized by civil society, but it passed without a word of criticism from Yudhoyono. Too often, Yudhoyono failed to speak out against such direct threats to fundamental human rights. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Yudhoyono only subscribes to the notion of human rights when it is politically expedient to do so. As in so many other policy areas that we've heard about, he simply preferred to take the path of least resistance, and a disappointed human rights community was always preferable to antagonizing powerful military or political interests. Ultimately, Yudhoyono's record on human rights may not be judged by his own achievements or failures, but by those of his successor. If, and I repeat, if incoming President Jokowi demonstrates that presidential agency can overcome institutional constraints, Yudhoyono's failure to apply this agency for the sake of human rights will become even more apparent than it is today. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Dominic. And you leave us with a very interesting image of Yudhoyono struggling to learn to cope with praise. It's now my pleasure to welcome Robin Bush to talk on religious politics and minority rights under the Yudhoyono administration. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks everyone for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's great to see you all. I'm going to start off with some images that have circulated in the Indonesian and international press over the last few years, and they kind of tell the story in themselves. On the top left is the iconic image of the brutal attack against the Ahmadis in early 2011. To the right of that is a Christian school in Temanggung that was burned down. On the lower left screen, side of the screen, is a Shia refugee population. And on the right is the Ahmadi Mosque in West Java that was closed with adherents inside. And as I said, these pictures really tell the story of deteriorating conditions for religious minority groups in Indonesia. This is not a new story. This story has already been told. As Dominic referenced, there have been multiple international reports on human rights and on minority rights and religious freedom in Indonesia over the last few years. Also some important domestic reports coming out of Indonesian NGOs. And that story has been told, it's been documented very well. So I'm not going to spend my time making that argument here. I think it's been made. What I'm going to focus on this morning is thinking directly about SBY's own role in all of this. And can we say that he has been just an innocent bystander, or has he in some way driven this process, this phenomenon? And if so, why? And what could be some of the motivations behind that? The overview of my talk, I'll spend just a few minutes going over some of the highlights, some of the major cases of violations against minority rights. And then I'll talk about SBY himself, and I will make an argument that he does bear some responsibility, that he's not just been an innocent bystander, and that there has been intentionality behind that. And I'll draw on some of his key appointments, some of the legislation that was enacted, some institutional developments under his tenure, and then I'll look at what might be going on for him around motivation. So very quickly, looking at the Ahmadiyya case, this is the most egregious and the most often discussed case when we talk about religious minorities in Indonesia. The Ahmadiyya presence has been in Indonesia since 1925. The Ahmadiyya community has experienced increasing discrimination and attack, especially after the 2008 joint decree that was issued by the Minister of Religious Affairs, the Attorney General, and the Minister of Home Affairs. As we know, the attacks culminated in early 2011 with a brutal attack by a large mob on 21 Ahmadis in Cikesik, West Java, killing 3 of them. Subsequent to that, further attacks have been ongoing. So what has been the role of the SBY administration on the Ahmadiyya issue? We have Yudhoyono's Minister of Religious Affairs, Surya Dharma Ali, has been particularly outspoken in his condemnation of Ahmadiyya several times, calling for the group to be banned. Greg Feely has documented the involvement of several other senior members of SBY's cabinet in anti-Ahmadiyya activity. We have Patrialis Akbar insisting that no human rights were breached during the attack on Ahmadiyya. We have the Minister of Defense approving a prayer mat approach in which soldiers would worship in Ahmadiyya mosques with the intention of converting them to the true path. And Gamawan Fauzi held what he called was a warm and friendly meeting with Habib Rizik of FPI a week after the attack. As for SBY himself, he took a very safe middle-of-the-road position. On one hand, he did condemn the violence. Of course, he called for the upholding of rule of law, as he always does. And he also did not issue a ban on Ahmadiyya, and he was being strongly pressured to do so at the time by Islamist groups. On the other hand, he did not in any way rein in or condemn the inflammatory remarks of his ministers. Feely, again, characterizes this as unwittingly fanning intolerance. I agree with this. I would say that it perhaps was not so unwitting, and talk about that more in a minute. The Shia, the case of the Shia in Indonesia, again, we know Islam in Indonesia is predominantly Sunni, but a Shia minority of more than 2 million has lived in Indonesia since pre-colonial days, largely peacefully. In 2010 and 2011, There were some strong attacks against a Shia school in East Java, injuring students. And then in 2011 and 2012 was the most recent large outbreak of violence in which the Shia community in Sampang and Madura was attacked, forcing them to flee. About 200 of them had to flee. The following year, a renewed attack on the same community. So about 500 of the community were forcibly evicted from their village to a tennis stadium nearby. Over the following year, government supplies and food and water were very sporadic, and then they were again forcibly evicted to a facility in Sidoarjo, where they remain to this day, as far as I know. Again, what is the role of SBY's administration? Surya Dharma Ali, again, front and center, repeatedly stating that Shia were not Muslim, should be forced to convert to true Islam. SBY himself criticized the police for their lack of inaction, for not protecting the Shia. He summoned the heads of police in Te'eni. He demanded action to be taken, but when no action was taken over time, as the situation became more protracted, he himself also did not follow up with any action or demands for action. The Christian houses of worship have been regulated by the state since 1969, have been a point of contention, increasingly so since 2006, with the joint regulation on houses of worship, which have made it even more difficult for the Christian minority to get permits to build churches. Sidney Jones has written about this in the past. According to church-related sources, since 2004, 430 churches have been attacked or closed. The most often discussed cases are the ones of Yasmin and Philadelphia. In both of these cases, the courts declared these churches legal. In the Yasmin case, all the way up to the Supreme Court declared legal, but local officials continue to refuse to allow the churches, to open. In typical Surya Dharma Ali approach of blaming the victim, he blamed the Christians for church closures and discrimination, accusing them of politicizing the issue. SBY's own stance on the Yasmin case, I think, is emblematic of his approach to minority rights more generally. He's very often issued statements in the media upholding religious freedom, the right of all Indonesians to follow their religion of choice. However, these vague statements are immediately followed by shifting the responsibility to other elements of government. In this case, he said, "I've handed it over to the mayor and the governor of West Java, along with some ministers, to handle this case." Setara Institute describes these statements as a mirage and says they have no meaning if not accompanied by explicit instruction to comply with the law. So those are just some of the key highlighted cases that are often discussed. Quickly, the trends in religious violence. There's two Indonesian NGOs that have been tracking religious violence in Indonesia since 2007, Setara Institute and Wahid Institute, and you can see the numbers on the screen in terms of the trajectory of incidents of violence, as they also track violations of religious freedom, similar trajectory. You will notice a slight dip in 2013, and we can talk about that if you'd like to during the question and answer period. Okay, so how much responsibility can we lay at the feet of Yudhoyono for these trends and rising intolerance and deteriorating conditions for human rights or for minority rights in Indonesia? According to the activists and the both international and Indonesian NGOs, responsibility can be placed at the feet of SBY, and I would agree with that. I'm going to talk about some of the key appointments and some of the legislation that took place during his years as argument that he was in fact not an innocent bystander. He didn't just let this happen, but there was intentionality behind it. Some of his key appointments. Okay, I've already talked about Surya Dharma Ali, which is I could talk about for quite some time, or Gamawan Fauzi. I think these are fairly well-known cases. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Maruf Amin, less well-known, but perhaps more influential in terms of access to SBY and impact on SBY. Maruf Amin was appointed by SBY in 2007 to the highly influential President's Advisory Council as his advisor on religious affairs. Amin is a senior Nahdlatul Ulama member and a senior MUI, Indonesian Ulama Council member, chaired the MUI Fatwa Council beginning in 2000, and was the primary architect of the anti-Sipilis and anti-Ahmadiyya fatwa. He's known for his conservative and in some cases anti-pluralist views. The second one on the list there is Sudi Silalahi, another very influential SBA insider. His relationship with Yudhoyono dates from their military days. Silalahi's own military record reflects his position on religious politics. He's reputed to be one of the generals who sent jihadists to Ambon at the height of the sectarian conflict in Maluku. When SBA became coordinating minister for politics and security, Silalahi was brought in as his lieutenant. And then in SBA's second term, he was named as state secretary. Silalahi was the designer and driving force behind Majlis Zikir, which is a traveling religious study group affiliated with the SBA campaign. And also, Silalahi is credited with mobilizing the Majlis Tafsir Al-Quran, a conservative religious network, into a political vehicle supportive of SBY. We can talk about Timor if you want to afterwards. Just quickly on institutions, I don't think I need to say a lot here. It is interesting to note that Setara Institute and Wahid Institute, in tracking the cases of religious violence, also tracked the perpetrators of this violence. And they document Front Pembela Islam and MUI as being tied for first place as the leading non-state actors involved in religious violence in those cases that they document. FBI has a long and confrontational and problematic relationship with Yudhoyono, multiple times issuing ultimatums to Yudhoyono. MUI also has a back and forth relationship with the Indonesian state, but under Yudhoyono it became closer to the state, receiving increasing funding from the Ministry of Religion. During SBA's last term, 4 of his cabinet members sat on the board of MUI, and And SBA gave MUI a lot of power to determine who was Islamic and who was not, outside of the bounds of MUI's version of Islamic teachings. Lastly, Bakor Pakam, this is a body that sits within the Attorney General's office, has branches in every province and district, and monitors religious activities. During the SBA administration, Bakor Pakam was extremely influential and active in the case of prohibition against Ahmadiyya propagation activities, banning of the Shia faith, and other religious minorities. I don't have time to talk about these pieces of legislation in detail, but suffice to okay. I want to move into talking about SBA's own motivations. So these are 4 pieces of legislation that were either enacted, upheld, or proposed during the SBA's years by various ministers in his cabinet that in various ways serve to restrict the religious freedom. So how can we understand SBA's actions on these issues? What we also know is that, as was mentioned already, he very frequently made public statements in the media upholding religious freedom, upholding minority rights, upholding rule of law. He imagined himself to be a great defender of minority rights, and certainly in the international media and international community often was seen as such. The mismatch between SBA's rhetoric and his apparent reputation and in the international community with his verifiable track record on the ground was nowhere more apparent than when the Appeal of Conscience Foundation in New York awarded President Yudhoyono its Statesman Award in recognition of his work to support human rights and religious freedom in the country. The outpouring of rage and incredulity that came out of Indonesia at that time was quite powerful. So again, how do we understand what may be an apparent contradiction in a military man known as being a moderate mainstream nationalist, presenting himself as an upholder of religious freedom in the international community and at home, with the track record that we've talked about. I'd like to argue that there is no contradiction, that is perfectly rational and makes a lot of sense, but that it even goes beyond political calculations to his own worldview. So I'm going to draw on three scholars. First, Michael Buehler, who's argued that political behavior can be explained by state elite competition. He argues that, he takes the case of Sharia legislation to argue that what this seemingly ideological and perhaps Islamist agenda is often promoted by by ostensibly secular or non-religious state elites for the purposes of gaining social capital, economic and cultural capital. So debunking a secular religious binary, which I think those of us who study Indonesia find it makes a lot of sense. If we think about applying this to SBA, then his support for Islamist positions can be seen as a rational political calculation in line with perceptions of an increasingly conservative and increasingly intolerant Muslim majority. Following that, Greg Feely has recently argued in a forthcoming publication, as he did yesterday as well, that Yudhoyono has a rational responsiveness to public opinion. Feely documents multiple opinion polls, both international and Indonesian, that show a rising intolerance in the Indonesian population. And he notes that SBY is an avid consumer of these public opinion polls. So from this, we can formulate an understanding of SBA's behavior as being very rational, purely transactional, a very political calculation. I would like to go one step further, though, and say that actually it might have something to do with a worldview, with a perhaps ideologically oriented worldview. And I'm drawing here on Jeremy Menchik's work called Productive Intolerance, and he's coined the term godly nationalism. So Menchik argues that Indonesian nationalism is assertively religious. He says godly nationalism conceptualizes belief as a civic virtue that accrues both individual and social benefits. The archetype of a good citizen is one who believes in God and uses that belief to motivate his or her behavior. Further, he says the state is the conduit for religious belief, guiding its citizens towards proper faith and behavior, and intolerance towards heterodoxy constitutes the nation. So Menchik develops this theory to explain some of the dynamics around the Ahmadiyya conflict in Indonesia. So under this framework, there's no contradiction between a strong nationalism and a strong, even conservative religious outlook. Religious belief is something which can and should be regulated and enforced by the state. Deviance is bad for the nation. Piety must be maintained by the state apparatus if necessary. Thus, actions like Surya Dharma Ali's endorsement of forced conversions of Ahmadis and Shia are to be supported, not reprimanded. Godly nationalism would explain SBY's motivations in his speech to MUI in 2005, in which he promised MUI, quote, a central role in matters regarding the Islamic faith, end of quote, a statement which was followed within days by MUI's anti-pluralism fatwa. In short, and in conclusion, by this formulation, President Yudhoyono has followed a path of perfectly rational behavior characterized by his cautious, consultative decision-making process in which he was influenced by his closest advisors and public opinion polls. That these advisors were of a conservative religious ilk probably does reflect Yudhoyono's own tendencies, which in this formulation are entirely consistent with a strong commitment to nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. So thank you to all three of our speakers for excellent talks, and I must say perfectly timed talks. Thank you. We now have about half an hour, a little less, for questions and discussion. We'll take 3 questions at a time, and if you could just say who you are and keep your questions brief. So, see 1, 2, 3.
Dave McRae, Uni of Melbourne. For Sidney primarily, but maybe also Dominic. I'm just interested in, you talk about Yudhoyono providing institutional autonomy to the security forces. Do you think he becomes directly involved in decisions of whether to charge people with terrorism or rebellion? Or is that something that police and prosecutors are being left to do, and sort of has the decision-making process on that stayed constant over the course of his 2 terms, or does it reflect different individuals moving through those security institutions? Thanks.
My question directed to Sidney. Joe Coleman recently retired from DFAT. Sidney, I was most interested in your comments, in fact, on the ABC Late Line program a couple of nights ago with on the problem of prisons in Indonesia and the way that the prisons are not being controlled. For example, with Abu Bakr Bashir and Aman Abdul Rahman, for example, that you mentioned in your comments, that these people are still proselytizing and promoting terroristic activities, if you like, from within prison, and the prison authorities are not making any attempt. Can you make a comment on the fact that President Yudhoyono made no attempt during his period, and do you see this as a continuing problem for Indonesia?
Thank you very much. My name is Al-Makin. I'm currently a visiting scholar at the University of Western Sydney. I have questions and perhaps also a comment for Ibu Robin Bush. Thank you very much. It seems that there are at least 2 narratives, and I do enjoy what you have presented, and thank you very much. That it seems a national narrative, and of course, SBY has in some way is responsible for what's happening in terms of his inaction and his reluctant to deal directly with the issues. However, it seems also local narratives, like the role of Bupati or head of the district, and also local parliaments in each case, like what happened in Sampang. It seemed that local MUI or local ulama also took certain benefits in order, to boost the popularity. And particularly also in Yogyakarta, in the Shia recent attack, it coincided with the local parliamentary elections. And after that, the attack also continued, particularly before the presidential election. It seemed that the radical groups seized the momentums, and at the same time, local politicians, the candidate of local parliaments, and also local head, local bupati, also took advantage. And I'm looking forward for your comments. Thank you very much.
With regard to Dave's question about the extent to which SBY becomes involved, I think on most decisions involving charges and sentencing, he wouldn't get involved. That would be left mostly to the police, and in fact, on the terrorism sentences, the police are involved in the sentences as well as the judges. But I think on exceptional cases or in response to particularly high-profile cases, then he might get involved. So I'm pretty sure that as coordinating minister, for example, he had to have been involved in determining what to charge those GOM negotiators with. I don't think he could not have been. And likewise, this discussion about charging the ISIS people with Makar, he had to have been involved in that as well. That can't just be Anshad and Bai talking, because that's dramatic. But I think on the run-of-the-mill things, no. On the prison issue, again, and it goes back to SBY always being reactive. So is he involved in the supervision of prisons, or does he consider that something that should take up his day? No. But when we had the big prison break in July 2013 from Maidan and 4 terrorists escaped and it was news all over the paper, then what are we doing about prisons? And attention by the president to that. Likewise, after the photo of Abu Bakr Bashir taking a pledge of loyalty to ISIS with more than a dozen other prisoners, all of a sudden, concern about prisons. So last week when he issued a 7-point instruction about what to do about the ISIS threat, better control over prisons was one of them. But it's always reactive.
Yeah, I would just add to that I've seen no evidence that he has been directly involved in any of the sentences, for example, in Papua and Maluku, but neither have I seen any evidence that he is opposed to them. So if he was, opposed to long prison sentences for example, non-violent separatists in Maluku, then he may or he should have indicated that, but he hasn't. And as I mentioned, the case, he was very close to one of the cases in 2007, and that would have been an opportunity for him to make a subtle sort of remark, but he didn't. And in fact, the leader of that group was initially sentenced to life in prison, which was later commuted to, I think, 15 years.
Thank you, Pa'al. I agree with you that local dynamic on these issues is very important, and we can have a whole other discussion about Parda Sharia and the local regulations. But in terms of the cases that you mentioned, the Shia and the Ahmadiyya, I think that, in fact, the point would be that where there are local leaders, religious and state, going against national state policy, SBA and his ministers have not enforced state policy. In fact, the opposite. So in the case of the Shia in Sampang, when there was a split that you referred to between the MUI central and MUI local, also NU own position, NU, PB NU, and the local East Java NU, in which the central bodies were saying the Shia is a bona fide sect of Islam, cannot be persecuted, and the East Java were saying, no, we need to ban them. Surya Dharma Ali, again, was the only member of government to side with the East Java faction of that side of that debate. On the case of Ahmadiyya, when the government did not ban Ahmadiyya and stopped short of restricting its activities, there were some, as you probably know, there was some local regulations came out restricting Ahmadiyya at the local level. Gamawan Fauzi, the Minister of Home Affairs, did not insist that this went against state policy, but in fact supported that. So that's my point, is that in these cases where one would expect a central guidance and from the president and his cabinet, we don't see that.
One, two, and up the back with the checker shirt. In the next round.
Obvious dumb question, but following on the sort of parting shots in the presentations by Sidney Jones and Dominic Berger, if SBY is, as you convincingly argued, responsible for setting the mood music for all of these policies and practices, then what should we expect in terms of the mood music coming from the new president? Insofar as we might think he's somewhat different in his musical tastes.
Greg showed us yesterday these wonderful pictures of the family, and in the background, of course, the bust of Sawo Edi. And Dominic mentioned it, what the potential role of that might be, but I think it extends beyond that. Sawo Edi was not only responsible for a lot of the 1965 killings, but he was also overseeing the referendum, the so-called referendum in Papua. So to what extent, given what we know about the influence of Sawo Edi on the family, given that we know that that influence continues to be very strong on SPY, how realistic was it in the first place to expect that SPY had anything but a conservative agenda on human rights or on Papua?
My question is to Robin Bush. I'm, like SPY, I'm an avid consumer of opinion polls, and one that struck me was the Morgan polls over the years, which have charted a significant decline in attendance at mosques by younger Indonesians. And I just wondered whether you could talk about the position of younger Indonesians in the face of all these conflicts. Is there a widening gap within that age group, or is there a force for liberalism, religious tolerance in that age group, or are they those who are not going to the mosques essentially just not interested?
In terms of mood music on Jokowi, I think that we won't see very much change on the way in which terrorism is handled. I do think that there'll be more instinctive openness toward some kind of dialogue on Papua, but as Budewi knows, it's not easy to define either what a dialogue should be or who to dialogue with. And I think when, if you look at the various initiatives that have taken place, largely under the Vice President's office, it's going to be, even if Jokowi is more instinctively inclined toward dialogue than a very conservative military-oriented approach, it's A, not going to be easy to get there, and B, there's going to be a lot of pushback even from people within PDIP. In terms of SPY's own approach toward not just Papua, but I think also Aceh, if you look at the remarks he made shortly after coming into office before the tsunami on Aceh, then it's clear that his instinct was insurgency has to be handled in part by a military approach. That was, and also, if you think about his nightmare scenario on Papua, SPY's nightmare scenario was that these international solidarity groups that established overseas offices like the International Parliamentarians for West Papua and the International Lawyers for West Papua would somehow be able to garner enough international support in concert with activists on the ground in Papua that the Act of Free Choice in 1969 would be open to question and delegitimized in a way that would allow for international intervention. That was the nightmare scenario, and that was why, from the president himself to the foreign ministry to the security agencies, there was this overreaction every time to any international expressions of support on Papua. But I think the countervailing dynamic to SPY's own very conservative, very militarily ingrained instincts were his desire to be a peacemaker. He got the infection of loving that on Aceh, and he really wanted it. He wanted success on Papua. It's just that he was constrained in his own conservative nationalist approach about how far he was willing to go to get there. And he was as risk aversive on this as on anything else.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. Jokowi has, of course, made a couple of remarks about Papua. He went there twice during the campaign, once during the legislative campaign and once during the presidential campaign. He has indicated that, in principle, he has no objections to greater access for foreign journalists and NGOs. He has remarked that he would build an istana in Papua, a palace, or as he said, a house, so that he could frequently visit and have dialogue and so on. But I mean, it's all very vague, of course, at this stage. But the problem is, of course, that SPY was never the driver of this policy. I'm referring to the criminalization of sort of peaceful dissent, in particular the flag and so on. So there's many other interests who would work against that if Jokowi had such ideas. And of course, after 10 years or more, this policy of seeing the flag as a very dangerous symbol has become so institutionalized that it's now much harder to unravel and suddenly, for example, allow greater display of the flag. Because for every Papuan that has been jailed in the last 10 or more years, that has added weight to the flag as a political symbol, as a symbol of rebellion and the state and so on. So I don't know what Jokowi will do. Similar. I mean, Jokowi has made several promising remarks. I mean, he has engaged with human rights groups during his campaign and in the transition period. Human rights groups like Contras, they have visited the transition office and so on. But again, on the other end of the spectrum, we see many other figures in his inner circle. And I mean, everyone is looking very closely now, sort of which end of the spectrum can exert, greater influence, whether it's the likes of, Contras and more progressive minded figures, or whether it's people like Yudhoyono and Wiranto and others.
Thanks for the question. I haven't seen that particular poll that you referenced, but I'm not sure how relevant attendance at mosques is for Indonesians, just because there's so many other forums and channels by which Indonesians express their religiosity and participate in religious activities. In fact, perhaps mosque attendance is one of the lesser ones. In terms of generational lines of trying to identify attitudes towards tolerance, I'm not sure that it splits that way either. I'm thinking of a study that came out a few years ago out of the State Islamic University in Jakarta, where they were studying schools and curriculum and teachers' attitudes within secondary schools in Jabotabek, and documented pretty strong levels of intolerance and attitudes about religious minorities. So I'm not sure the split is as simple as a generational one.
Ibu Dewi, Chris, and is there a question up the back? Can you take us up the back? There's one hand up, way up towards the back. Sorry, people in the front.
Thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate all three speakers. I've really enjoyed them, and I don't have any arguments with any of your presentations. But I'd just like to focus on what Robin has been saying. On this, SBY, your thesis is really that this is intentional. He's chosen all of this very conservative ministers and so on. From my own observation, I think that both the president and the vice president, using very superficial observation, they're both from more abangan backgrounds and have very little confidence when addressing a community that seems to be more religious. It's very different from Gus Dur, who had the authority and who could talk down and who could criticize his constituents without in danger of being accused of being a bad Muslim. The same goes for Pak Yusuf Kala, because he's very strongly very confident and comfortable in this Islamic background, chair of the Dewan Masjid and so on. So that he is much more confident to talk and criticize openly. I remember when Pak Yudhoyono criticized the microphones at the mosques that were being used, broadcast, outside and disturbing everybody, especially in the evening. Republica absolutely took, really attacked him openly, day in and day out, and forgetting all other things. But when Pak Yusuf Kala said the same thing, silence. So both of these gentlemen were always very scared of pushing their points of view. And when you look at the ministers, I think that was just a draw of the cards. I don't think Yudhoyono actually chose Suryadandama Ali because he's a conservative Muslim. He was chosen to be in cabinet because he happened to be the one that was represented in P3 and he was chairman of P3. And we didn't know that he was so appalling, you know. Pak Gamawan was chosen to be in the cabinet because he was a very good mayor of, a good bupati of Solok and a brilliant governor of Sumatra, of West Sumatra. He got award for good governance, anti-corruption, etc., etc. Timur Pradopo, unfortunately, got to be police chief because he was the most acceptable one to the police themselves when there were two other very, very strong candidates. He was the poorest candidate, actually. So he was, you know, the optional choice. So, and he just got unlucky when it came to this. Now that Pak Lukman Hakim has replaced Pak Suryadandama Ali, he's brilliant. He has been able to, you know, to say whatever needed to be said on ISIS and criticisms of radical groups. So, in a way, it's not that deterministic. You know, he didn't go out of his way to appoint these people because they were conservative. So that's my comment. Now, come to Jokowi. Given the fact that he was so vulnerable to black campaign about his lack of Islamic credentials and so on, how far do you think he could go? Because he wants to carry favor with all those people who voted for the Prabowo, who is now in the coalition Merah Putih. Is Yusuf Kala's presence in the vice president sufficient for Jokowi to go out of his way to talk down and say, you know, stop being so intolerant and so on? Do you think he would have the ability to do that?
So we have two more questions. We're nearly at time. So
okay. Chris Manning, visiting ANU and from Jogja. My question's mainly to Robin, but maybe the other speakers might have a reaction as well. In the work that I've been doing, I have the sense that SBY changed over the period of time, and he changed mainly because of the political demise of his party, and he was trying to save it through economic policy, through various actions. So he was, people have been talking about SBY as if he was the same from the start to the end. And my question is, I mean, did he change as a consequence of his political vulnerability, as it became increasingly clear that the Democrats were just going to go right down the tube? I mean, yeah, that's the question.
My name is Leah. I'm from Melbourne University, and my questions will be for Mbak Robin. As Indonesian, I'm particularly very concerned with the religious intolerance which increased, if I can say, during the SBY era, and especially in regard to the discrimination for the interfaith marriage in Indonesia. I've been married for 10 years with my husband. Also, we have different religions, and due to the marriage law in Indonesia, it's actually not allowed. But on the first years of our marriage, we hear a lot about people from like Paramadina Institute or from Wahid Institute is actually support us defending the right for Indonesian, among Indonesian to get married, even though we may have different religion. But lately, I think for the last second term of President SBY, we don't hear their support anymore. What I can see that there's a lack of modern Islam or Islam thought, or from the Islam or especially Christians also in Indonesia, to concerns about this kind of issues. And also in regard of the media, we don't hear a lot support in this kind of issue. So I would like to know from Mbak Robin, where are they going now? I mean, where is the voice of those moderate Islam or other religions, and also the role of media in promoting pluralism and tolerance in Indonesia?
Okay, I know we're out of time, so try to make this very quick. Ibu Dewi, fair enough. I take your points. I know that my thesis is a little bit provocative, and it's also highly speculative, so I think it's very fair to say, well, he didn't choose those people. I would say in response, okay, but he also didn't rein them in when they were explicitly issuing statements that were conflicting with state policy and what policy that he himself had stated in multiple times. So yes, he didn't choose them, but he could have guided them in a direct that he could have. In terms of, we can talk later about the lack of confidence. That's a huge issue, and I think that's very pervasive, and we see that in the police a lot in terms of reasons why they don't protect minority rights. Well, we don't know, we're not ulama, we don't have the expertise. Yeah, that's something that we hear a lot in Indonesia. Jokowi, I'm optimistic because from what I heard from people who were working with him in the campaign, when the smear campaign started, he issued very firm direction that there would be no response, that he wanted his cadre of campaign volunteers to not respond at all, to just ignore playing the religious card. And I think that was successful. And so I think I'm optimistic that he's going to have the strength, and it seemed that the voters supported that stance. So I am optimistic on that. As to whether he changed over time, and on Lukman Hakim at the end, my sort of mini thesis is that yes, he was reading the tea leaves, he was reading the direction of the wind blowing and seeing that public opinion was no longer so supportive of a conservative position, and especially Surya Dharma Ali's position. Appointing Lukman Hakim was a refreshing breath of fresh air, but maybe too little too late to save his own legacy. That would be my contention. Just quickly on where have been the moderates in the last few years, I don't know. The Wahid Institute, who has been tracking all of this, they have the opposite conclusion. In terms of the dip in numbers that I pointed out in 2013, I asked them why did incidents of religious violence go down actually in 2013, and they said, well, they felt that actually media and public opinion were starting to be galvanized around the issue of religious minorities and religious violence, and so there was beginning to be some social pressure in support of minority rights. So I don't know. As always in Indonesia, it's very complex, and there's multiple perceptions of these things. We can talk later about that.
Yeah, just one comment on the Jokowi-Kala relationship, because I'm not sure how it's going to work on the issue of dealing with radical Islam. I agree that Jokowi has now been successful twice in his campaign as governor and in his campaign for president in defeating smear campaigns, so that may actually embolden him. But I think that's going to be a very dicey relationship between the president and the vice president, and including on Papua, not just on radical Islam, because Kala has his own intentions and desires to be a peacemaker on Papua, and it may clash very strongly with what Jokowi wants to do.
Dominic. Sadly, we are out of time. I know there were one or two more questions. Please try to catch the speakers over a coffee. We now have until 10 to 11, about 20 minutes for coffee. But please join with me in thanking our three speakers.